Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris, or welcome if it's your first time. This is part 8. How the United States became independent from kings and generals. I clicked on the little thumbs up. If you could do that for me, that helps. You could subscribe, that helps. And if you'd like to sponsor a video, just click on the thanks button, donate to the channel, and then tell me what video to react to. Outside of that, you can still request. It just takes longer to get to if you don't donate. And you can donate and not have me do any video. It's strictly your choice. All right, let's get into the video.
By late November 1781, news of the defeat at Yorktown had reached Europe. Britain greeted the news with despair, while France celebrated. While his fellow American diplomats joined in the celebrations and urged immediate negotiation to conclude the war, Benjamin Franklin was more reserved. Yorktown was a war-winning victory, and standard diplomatic logic dictated using it as quickly as possible to secure as favorable a peace as possible. Indeed, a bankrupt Congress was demanding it. However, Franklin's hands were tied. Per the Treaty of Alliance, America and France could not negotiate peace without the other's consent, and France was eager to continue the war. Peace would have to wait for the war to exhaust itself. Welcome to our video on the end of the American Revolution, in which the final stages of the war are concluded and a new nation is born. This video is made available for free thanks to our YouTube members and patrons. We fund our free content through our program of exclusive future videos and much more. You will be able to watch more than 100 exclusive videos today. Thanks for supporting us. Admiral Thomas Graves's relief force arrived off Yorktown on October 24th, 5 days after Charles Cornwallis formally surrendered. After rescuing stranded loyalists, he sighted France's Comte de Grasse's fleet, but did not engage with it. The French still outnumbered him, and with Cornwallis already lost, his mission had failed. Graves, therefore, returned to New York to report to Commander-in-Chief Henry Clinton. Cornwallis's 8,000 soldiers were marched to camps and prison towns throughout the American interior, while the sailors and engineers were loaded onto French ships. The roughly 12,000 escaped slaves among the British were imprisoned to be returned to their masters alongside looted American property. That accomplished, de Grasse returned to the Caribbean, while the Continental Army marched to New York. Comte de Rochambeau's French army wintered in Virginia, preparing to be redeployed to other theaters in spring. Upon Graves's return to New York, Clinton reportedly despaired. The war he'd never wanted to direct was now completely lost. Nathanael Greene's campaign had already pinned the British to the coast, with only Charleston and a small garrison in Wilmington to show for the entire 1780 to 1781 campaign. Wilmington was quickly abandoned as there were no resources to support it. Not waiting for orders from London, Clinton abandoned all plans for offensive action against the Americans and ordered all forces to stay close to their supply bases. George Washington arrived in New York in late November and set winter quarters in Newburgh. This was the Continental Army's final encampment. For the next 2 years, British and American soldiers stared at each other across their fortifications. The armies never campaigned again. Occasional clashes between patrols or skirmishes between Patriot militias and Loyalist holdouts were the only hostilities in the East. The main war was over, but the frontier war continued. The recapture of Vincennes had convinced the British that confronting the Americans in central Illinois was suicidal. However, Detroit would not concede. Instead, the British planned a multi-pronged campaign to isolate Vincennes and conquer Spanish Louisiana. Per this plan, the West Florida garrison would capture New Orleans and then retake Natchez. Troops from Detroit would recruit allies from the prairie tribes, then take St. Louis and Cahokia before advancing down the Mississippi. Meanwhile, Captain Henry Byrd would take 150 British soldiers and 1,000 native allies, primarily Shawnee, and drive the Americans from western Kentucky.
Just want to point out that Cahokia is where I went when I had did some shorts. I got peanuts. I went to Cahokia on some of my shorts, and I showed the mounds from the Mississippian people. Really cool. Something that if you're interested in, the mounds, there's 80 of them left today. The one that I was on is 7 stories high today. They were around 1,000 years ago, so imagine the erosion. But it's very pretty cool. Very pretty cool. It's pretty cool. And then I've been to Fort Sackville and Vincennes, or Fort Sackville's in Vincennes. A lot of cool stuff right there. And this is Illinois River, and I'm somewhere around here. Not back then, though.
Isolated and surrounded, Vincennes would have to surrender. The plan was a failure. The Spanish overran most of West Florida in 1779, while the attacks on St. Louis and Cahokia broke against their fortifications. Byrd's Kentucky expedition killed around 20 settlers and took at least 300 captives, but never threatened the main settlement at Lexington before supply problems forced it to withdraw. Many settlers fled smaller settlements to shelter in Lexington or to more populated eastern Kentucky, but America remained in control. Vengeance was demanded and swiftly delivered. In early August, Virginia Brigadier General George Rogers Clark organized 1,000 militia bent on punishing the Shawnee. Clark planned to advance up the Mad River, burning every Shawnee village he encountered up to their main town of Piqua. Privately, he hoped to loot sufficient supplies to establish a deep base in Shawnee territory for a follow-up campaign against Detroit to permanently end the British threat. As usual, the Shawnee deserted their villages as Clark approached, leaving only their homes and fields to be burned. Clark then marched north from Chillicothe to Piqua, arriving on August 8th. Here, the Shawnee uncharacteristically chose to stand and fight. Piqua was home to about 3,000 Shawnee and served as their main military base. Its fortifications and 800 acres of crops were essential for upcoming campaigns in Kentucky. Additionally, Loyalist agent Simon Girty wanted Clark defeated to dispel his near-mythical reputation.
George Rogers Clark, for the frontier, was looked at like Washington on a much different scale, but in terms of frontier fighters, like if you were going to go into the frontier to fight and you were told, okay, there's this guy, and George Rogers Clark, people were like, I want Clark, because you just knew you're going to win. He was smart. He was borderline insane, but he was going to get it done.
Most of the warriors were positioned on the wooded right, behind breastworks. 50 warriors were in the blockhouse, with others spread along the rest of the stockade and in the outlying fields. As Clark approached, he split his force in 3. The right force was to sweep along the Mad River before crossing and attacking the village's rear. The left would clear the woods, while Clark and the center attacked the town. Despite knowing that Clark was coming, his arrival seems to have caught the Shawnee by surprise, as Clark's infantry swept through the fields while they were still being farmed, fighting his way up to the defenses with minimal resistance. The cavalry successfully swept the riverbank, but cliffs prevented them from engaging the fortifications. The blockhouse and breastworks repelled Clark's attack, until he blew the blockhouse apart with artillery. This collapsed the defenses and the Shawnee fled. Clark reported 27 casualties, but historians suspect the real total was closer to 80. Shawnee casualties are unknown, as they removed all but 6 dead and 2 wounded during the battle. Finding only unripe corn and rotten supplies, Clark burned Piqua's buildings and fields before withdrawing. Piqua was the largest sustained battle west of the Appalachians fought up to that point. and it left the Shawnee reeling. The casualties from Piqua were high enough that the Shawnee could not launch another raid on their own. However, the Lenape, Wyandot, Miami, and Mingo tribes had their own territorial ambitions and grievances against the Americans. With British prodding and funding, they joined the war in 1780. 1781 saw expeditions launched by both sides, with numerous settlements burned across the Ohio Valley and western Pennsylvania. Caught between the fighters were communities of pacifist Moravian Christian Lenape, who were distrusted by both sides. In September 1781, the Wyandots and non-Christian Lenape forcibly relocated many of them to the Sandusky River on suspicion of spying. On March 8, 1782, the Pennsylvania militia, frustrated and enraged by Lenape raids, took out their rage on the village of Gnadenhutten, murdering 96 Christian Lenape with hammer blows to the head as they prayed. This was immediately condemned by Congress and only served to escalate the conflict. 1782 was remembered as the Year of Blood in Kentucky. Devastating raids by the Allied tribes drove settlers from dozens of small settlements, while attempts at retaliation were ambushed and massacred. However, in September, Detroit was ordered to cease operations. Peace was coming. Without British backing, the tribes lacked the means to continue attacking settlers. After Clark burned a number of Ohio Shawnee villages in November, fighting tapered off. However, this was not peace, and the conflict reignited 4 years later. Meanwhile, de Grasse returned to the Caribbean in November 1781. He'd been able to sail for Yorktown, due to the Spanish watching French colonies in his absence in exchange for his help in their 1782 offensives. De Grasse and Louisiana's governor, Bernardo de Galvez, had agreed that their strategic target was Jamaica, Britain's primary regional fortress. Both agreed they could only successfully invade it together, but also that Jamaica was too well defended to attack straight away. Some combination of St. Augustine, the Windward Islands, and the Bahamas would be taken first to isolate Jamaica once de Grasse returned. By the time de Grasse returned, Galvez had new directives from Madrid. Spain's principal war goal was the recapture of Gibraltar. It was so important that a secret clause in the Treaty of Aranjuez stated that France would not make peace until Spain had taken Gibraltar. However, the Great Siege of Gibraltar was now entering its third year with no measurable progress. Increasingly, it looked like the only hope would be to convince the British to trade Gibraltar for something of equal or greater value. The only target that fit the bill was Jamaica, whose sugar production was worth more than the total pre-war output of the 13 colonies. Madrid ordered Galvez to invade Jamaica immediately, while an increasingly broke Versailles ordered de Grasse to find a way to end the war quickly. Thus, de Grasse committed to invading Jamaica alongside the Spanish once reinforcements arrived. As these reinforcements weren't expected until April, de Grasse decided to move against the Windward Islands, taking a number of small islands and besieging St. Kitts in January. The British garrison there capitulated in February, and de Grasse returned to Martinique for repairs and to await his reinforcements. Meanwhile, the Spanish Havana fleet prepared to invade the Bahamas. By April 3rd, de Grasse's reinforcements arrived, and repairs were complete. Thus, on April 8th, he set sail with 35 capital ships. Admiral George Rodney had 36 at nearby St. Lucia, and immediately moved to intercept de Grasse. Facing personal and financial ruin back home, Rodney needed a glorious victory to save himself. The British were able to catch the French rearguard on April 9th, thanks to having been recently upgraded with copper hull plating, which prevented marine growth from slowing ships. De Grasse detached the troop convoy with escorts and turned to engage. The British vanguard engaged de Grasse around 1000. The breeze picked up around 1200, enabling half the British and most of the French fleet to engage. By 1400, de Grasse realized that he was poorly positioned against the approaching British centre and rearguard and broke off, retreating to the Saint Islands. For the next 2 days, the two fleets tried to tempt the other to attack at a disadvantage unsuccessfully. On April 12th, as the French sailed north through the Salt Passage, several damaged ships fell behind. Rodney seized the opportunity to attack, prompting de Grasse to turn around through the easterly wind to engage. The battle commenced at 0800, with the two battle lines exchanging broadsides as they sailed past each other. At 0900, the wind shifted to the southeast, forcing the French line to turn toward the British to maintain its speed and loosen the formation. Rodney recognized the opening and, at 9:20, ordered his ships to turn into the disorganized French, cutting their line into three. De Grasse's flagship was cut off from the fleet and surrounded, and the French began fleeing to the west as the wind shifted again. 5 French ships were captured, with de Grasse among the prisoners, and many surviving French ships were severely damaged. Damage to his fleet convinced Rodney not to pursue the French fleet as it fled. He didn't need to, as Jamaica was saved. French survivors trickled into Saint-Domingue and linked up with the Spanish in May. However, Galvez cancelled the invasion. He believed the combined fleet wouldn't match Rodney without de Grasse's leadership. Worse, while the fleet underwent repairs, disease ravaged the invasion force, leaving it combat ineffective. Thus, despite the successful capture of the Bahamas on May 6th, further offensive action in the Caribbean was cancelled and the Allies switched to defence. Meanwhile, the British were lurching towards peace. When news of Yorktown reached London on November 25, 1781, Prime Minister Frederick North exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." North attempted to stave off the Whigs, who were forcing his resignation, by proclaiming during budget negotiations that North American troop levels would remain intact, but no further offensives away from fortified supply bases were allowed, unknowingly validating Clinton's orders. This promise allowed the budget to pass, but the Whigs smelled blood. On December 12th, the Royal Navy botched the intercepting of a large French transport fleet in the Bay of Biscay. Angered and sensing an opportunity, the Whigs demanded an official inquiry into the Admiralty, looking to oust North's ally Lord Sandwich as First Lord, following the Christmas recess. Seeing the threat, North attempted to mollify the Whigs by sacrificing another ally, Secretary of State George Germain. In exchange for a peerage, Germain accepted fault for the war's failures and resigned in February, but it was too late. Word of more Caribbean losses arrived in January, and the Whigs moved in for the kill. They demanded and got Guy Carleton to replace Clinton. Carleton had been a Whig MP since resigning his governorship in 1777. On February 27th, Parliament voted to formally disavow further war in America. The news that Minorca had fallen enabled the Whigs to hold 2 votes of no confidence in North, which narrowly failed. Rather than risk another, North offered his resignation to King George III, who had to be persuaded to accept on March 20th. After Whig leader Lord Shelburne refused to form a government in a piece of political gamesmanship, he was instead made a Secretary of State, while Lord Rockingham became Prime Minister. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin welcomed the news of North's fall. He'd stated publicly that America would never negotiate with Lord North, partly out of spite and partly because he knew the Whigs were eager for peace and would offer more than the Tories to get it. With North gone, Franklin formally declared America's demands. As a precondition to negotiation, American independence had to be accepted. Franklin then demanded that all of British North America, including what is now Canada, should be included in the new American nation. However, negotiations could not begin without the French. To learn America's negotiation stance, the British had been floating peace proposals to Henry Laurens, a captured American envoy, for over a year. After releasing Laurens to meet with Franklin, Britain stated that American independence was a negotiation point, not a precondition. On April 23rd, after keeping Franklin's proposal secret even to Parliament, Shelburne offered America independence, but no territorial concessions. He then approached the French and offered them American independence, their stated war goal, in exchange for the return of British Caribbean islands. French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes angrily rejected the proposal, stating that victorious nations may demand more than their stated goals, as the British had done in 1763, and that the French demands were separate from the Americans. The Americans would negotiate their independence, not France. While Vergennes probably intended this as an arrogant dismissal, both Shelburne and Franklin understood that he had abrogated the Treaty of Paris's joint negotiation clause. Though they were now free to pursue peace separately from France, the negotiations only grew more complex. On April 19th, the Dutch Republic formally accepted John Adams as America's ambassador, something not even the French had done, effectively accepting American independence. Then, on May 18th, news of the Battle of the Somme arrived, strengthening Britain's hand and weakening France's. However, when new diplomats arrived in Paris and were confronted about the silence on Franklin's proposal, Shelburne's exposed duplicity caused an uproar.
Sorry, I just want to go back. So, I apologize. I was watching, I was just like, oh wow, the ship is sinking. And then my eyes were fixated on this guy right here. All right, just keep an eye on him while you're listening.
And weakening France's. However, when new diplomats arrived in Paris and were confronted about the silence on Franklin's proposal, Shelburne's exposed duplicity caused an uproar in Parliament. This was made worse when Rockingham died on July 1st, and Shelburne became Prime Minister, causing the Whigs to split and a cabinet reshuffle, further delaying negotiations. Meanwhile, Shelburne secretly sent a letter to Washington, informing him that Britain would accept American independence as a precondition, using the communication delays to hide it from Franklin. Meanwhile, the French and Spanish were making their own moves. Both were concerned about American independence and wanted to limit America's potential to threaten their interests. France wanted to keep America away from the Newfoundland fisheries and the Gulf of Mexico, while Spain was afraid of revolutionaries on its colonial borders. The Spanish proposed to the French that America's borders be the Appalachian Mountains. Canada would retain the Ohio Country, while the rest of British Louisiana would be transferred to Spain as an Indian reserve, which would actually be a buffer zone. France would receive the fishing rights America had previously enjoyed as British citizens. Meanwhile, the French began sending separate envoys to Britain, while insisting the Americans continue negotiating alongside Vergennes in Paris. His suspicions about French loyalties and Spanish intentions confirmed, Franklin moved to rid himself of Vergennes. Diplomatic politeness and America's debt to France were now the only leverage the French had to include themselves in negotiations. Congress owed tens of millions of livres to France. However, neither Congress nor Versailles knew how many millions. Neither treasury had kept especially accurate records, and what records existed conflicted. Somewhere between 18 and 50 million livres had crossed the Atlantic, but it was unclear how much of that money was gifts versus loans, and which loans were made from the king versus private entities. Thus, Franklin sidelined Vergennes by settling the repayment terms. France's desperate financial situation made the treasury grateful to accept Franklin's proposal to only repay the 18 million livres the French government proved were government loans, with the first payment to begin 3 years after the peace treaty was signed. Freed from the financial leash, Franklin allowed John Jay and Adams to begin negotiating directly with the British. By October, word had gotten back about Shelburne's letter. This humiliated the British negotiators, gutted their position, and drove them to conclude a deal quickly. The pre-Quebec Act border would be the new one between America and Canada, though it would take more treaties to define it. America would also receive all British territory north of Florida and west to the Mississippi River, with America getting fishing rights in Newfoundland and Britain's navigation rights on the Mississippi. Naturally, neither side cared to ask the local indigenous tribes their opinions on how their ancestral land was being divided up. There was tension over the Loyalists in America, whom both the Americans and British knew would be forced to flee. Britain demanded they be compensated for their confiscated property, only for Franklin to counter that patriots should be compensated for British economic raiding. It was agreed that Congress would merely ask the states to consider compensation, an ultimately and intentionally empty gesture. The preliminary deal was signed on November 30th, despite Vergennes protesting being cut out. This left London free to deal with the three remaining combatants. Lord North initiated the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780 over its arms sales to France and support for American smugglers and privateers. This may sound insane, but it was actually a strategic move. The Dutch Republic had begun making moves to join Russia's League of Armed Neutrality following British crackdowns on Dutch smuggling. Dutch accession would have certainly drawn the whole League into the war. To prevent this, in one of his signature calculated moves, North declared war. He reasoned that first, the League didn't want war with Britain. Second, Russia would not allow the Dutch to enter the League if they were already at war. Third, no one would aid the Dutch if the British attacked with legitimate grievances. And fourth, there was no threat. The once supreme Dutch navy only had 20 capital ships, having been allowed to wither and literally rot since the War of Spanish Succession. Thus, declaring this war would prevent a wider one, and privateering against Dutch ships and colonies would refill the depleted exchequer. For once, North had done his math correctly. The League refused the Dutch, and while the French did rescue threatened Dutch colonies, there was no additional threat to British interests. France and Spain had been dragging their feet in the negotiations, hoping for a successful final assault on Gibraltar. Its failure, coupled with the Anglo-American peace agreement, forced Spain and France to begin negotiating in earnest in January 1783. The final deal gave Spain all of Florida and Minorca. France would keep Tobago and reclaimed Senegal, but the British retained all other lost Caribbean islands. The Dutch surrendered Negapatnam in India, Britain's only gain. The treaties of Paris were all formally signed on September 3, 1783. With peace approaching, Washington and Carrollton met on May 6, 1783 to discuss the British evacuation. Savannah had been evacuated on July 11, 1782, and Charleston on December 14th. Only New York was left. Washington's priority was to arrange for both sides' prisoners to be released. More Americans had died in captivity than in all the battles combined, and Washington was desperate to rescue them. Once the release was agreed on, Washington pressed Carrollton on the evacuation timeline. Carrollton demurred, as he didn't know when transports would be available, nor how many more loyalists would seek to flee America for the Caribbean or Canada. However, they agreed on the handover procedures. Finally, Washington asked for all American property, including slaves, to be returned. Carrollton allowed the recovery of looted items, but not the 3,000 escaped slaves in New York. To send them back to slavery after officially promising freedom would be a national embarrassment. That settled, both men returned to their lines to wait for the end. In August, Carrollton was formally ordered to begin evacuating New York. A sudden surge of expelled loyalists delayed the departure until November. On November 16th, Washington marched into Manhattan, 7 years after being driven out. The last British soldiers departed on the 25th. On December 23rd, Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and returned to civilian life. The American Revolution was over. We hope you have enjoyed our series on the American.
I hope you guys enjoyed my series on the American Revolutionary War. This is written and directed by me. I did the voices. I did the characters. I did all of this, all by myself. So I hope you appreciate it. It was pretty easy too. There was nothing to it. All right. So I was always kind of curious about what happened afterwards in those 2 years of peace, because it was just like we were done, but now we're waiting for everyone else to get everything sorted out. It is what it is. All right. Well, we're going to end this here. I hope you enjoyed. I did. And until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.